ladies and gentlemen, in the blue corner, standing at a sleek 5'11", 245 pounds, the tumultuous tempest of technique, Thomas Lilley. And in the red corner, at a curvaceous 5'11", 315 pounds, the jovial juggernaut of judgment, John Sheridan. A meeting of the masters of mastication. Turn your attention as they delve deep into all things lifting and more. This is Peak Speak.
Welcome back to Peak Speak.
Subtle, professional, excellent. I love it.
Exactly.
How are you doing, Thomas?
Tired. I'm not a big fan of getting up at bullshit o'clock and immediately having to do these podcasts, but it's for the people, and I love the people.
Well, soon it won't be so bullshit early because it won't be daylight savings anymore.
That's right. And
then we'll be in the same time zone.
Wait, hang on a sec. It ends up being the same time that I have to get up and record them anyway, regardless.
No, because I don't have to finish as late. As early, because I'm an hour ahead of you. So we can start recording at 7:30 your time, and it's not an issue. And it's fine.
The irony is the hour of technical difficulties each time means that it is 7:30 my time right now anyway. But with that aside, how are things in the
Thomas
world
is the
of Burley
least technologically
and John?
proficient person you'll ever meet. And our internet connection's unstable. That's ironic. Okay, you're back. Now I can see you. Sorry, I got some serious lag there.
That's okay.
So we're back. What are we talking about?
I just said, how are things in the world of Burley and John?
Yeah, good. Nothing major to report, really. Which is nice. Nice to have a weekend without a comp or a workshop on, so I can actually have a Sunday to myself. And yeah, we've got a couple of people prepping for the Arnold's Strongman show next weekend, which will be cool. And then we've got States the week after that. So a bunch of our guys and girls are peaking at the moment, hitting some heavy stuff, which is always fun. And yeah, then we got States, and then we got a bit of time off without a comp for a while, which would be nice.
Awesome. So we've got some cool stuff lined up. We're both heading down to Pro Raw next weekend.
Yup.
A few interviews lined up for you cool cats.
And you uncool cats. We don't discriminate.
So some cool interviews coming up, which will be fun. We've been looking forward to doing some more interviews. And
it'll be nice to be able to podcast in the same room rather than on the internet. Because despite what our fantastic media team does, in case you can't tell, we're not in the same room.
Yes, exactly. And today I have no internet at home thanks to the wonderful people at Telstra. Shout out to them. I am using my mobile phone hotspot and there appears to be a massive delay. So this episode might be choppy. However, we will persist.
Fortunately, the audio and the video will be fine because those things are recorded independent of internet access.
That's right. Sam, work your magic.
Work it, Sam. Work it.
What are we talking about?
So initially I was going to suggest we talk about the sort of post-competition phase because we're in that time of year where a lot of people are going into a post-competition phase. But then I figured there's also a bunch of people who are doing a competition and then going straight back into competition mode in preparation for things like nationals and stuff like that. So I thought it would be interesting to have a discussion about like a yearly plan and what a training year looks like and sort of expand on the idea of training phases and how you'd prep for things and build on that sort of conversation from there. So I think the interesting discussion for me is always like how many comps a year should you do? You know, I think that's one of the most common questions I get once people start taking things reasonably seriously, like when they go from just competing in novice comps because it's fun to wanting to do things a little bit more seriously. The discussion inevitably turns to how many comps should I do in a year and what a good balance is. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that front.
Yeah, first. Cool. See, I love this. I love this subject because I think for a long period, and it's changing now, but for a long period, everyone kind of existed in like 12-week blocks of time where it was just like 12 weeks peak, 12 weeks peak, 12 weeks peak, and we saw a lot of people just kind of get axed and beat up and ruined because of that endless cycle of like 12 weeks peak, 12 weeks peak, too often peaking. So my thoughts on the whole thing, if I'm taking a serious lifter, it ends up being about 3 comps per year where one comp doesn't actually matter. It's like one comp is a qualifier for the next big comp, and then the next big comp is either a qualifier for the next big comp or they're both sort of on a similar level. For example, it's like you do a states to qualify you for nationals. Nationals is a big comp, and then you might do a worlds or a pro raw type arrangement. And the 2 big comps are those nationals and pro raw type arrangements, right? The thing that has to preface all of this, the thing that you have to realize when you're mapping out a period of time training, like a year's worth of training, is that the more time that you spend peaking, the less time you spend getting stronger.
Yes.
Because peaking doesn't make you stronger. So the more often you're at that 90% plus sort of range, the less time you have to actually get stronger and to improve. The volatility of heading into that 90% plus range, the trade-off between the trade-off for safety is potentially going to be a little bit more negative the more time you spend up there as well. So it's like we want to spend more time actually getting stronger so that each time you do step on the platform, you're stronger than before. So for me, it's like 6 months of training towards one big comp, and then another 3 to 4 months training towards the next big comp, and then back into that cycle again when you start training back up. So for example, if we're to take like a case study, I would use Dylan Hellriegel from Perth. He's a fucking monster over there.
Absolute monster. I'm excited to see him crush some huge weights at Pro Raw.
Yeah, so at the moment, if we go back a year, last year he did Pro Raw and then he came on with me and he wanted to do big dog. So we spent the first 3 to 4 months just building a base before we started switching gears to strength work and then heading into a peak into big dogs. And during that period, we took him from a 355 squat at Pro Roll into a 435 squat at big dogs, for example. So
that's fucking crazy, man.
Yeah, and you know, I've said this publicly before, is that the 355 squat at Pro Roll wasn't his max. We don't know what his max was, but we gave him the tools to facilitate the expression of that strength more appropriately when big dogs came around. So after big dogs, he decided, okay, well, I want to do pro raw and big dogs, and my suggestion was to take pro raw a little bit easier so we could work on some weaknesses, focus a bit more on bench, take the attention off squats and deadlifts so much for a while. So we did that. Now we're coming into pro raw, and we haven't peaked as aggressively as we did for big dogs, and yet still he's looking stronger than ever. And then we'll go do a similar arrangement after pro raw. We'll go back to some base work before peaking up again into big dogs, and we'll peak a bit harder for that, and we should see what he's really capable of by the time that big dogs comes around. And I mean, coming into pro raw now, he's looking stronger than ever as well. So it's going to be really exciting. But the whole point of that is that he could have done any fucking comp he wanted to and lifted massive, but it wouldn't have been as big jumps as it would have if we spent more time just in the middle working on weaknesses, working on stability, doing the stuff that actually makes you stronger when it counts.
Yeah, and I think that's the really important discussion behind any discussion about comp schedules is the difference between building and testing strength. Like competitions and peaking is about refining and testing strength. Everything else you do is that's the real work. That's where you're making your money, so to speak. So I think my views essentially mirror yours in many ways. I think 2 or 3 comps for most people a year is plenty. I think it's a little bit different with a really brand new or novice lifter. I sort of encourage them to compete a little bit more regularly because I think it helps you improve at the skill of competing, because the way you handle comp day nerves, the way you approach the warm-up sequences and how you eat and all of those sort of things, they're all skill sets that you can't really learn or you can't teach effectively without having experienced it a few times. And for most people, that first comp is really just going to be a bit of a blur anyway. You know, they're going to do it and then be like, oh shit, I barely remember what happened because it was such an emotional day, and you know, everything goes into one thing, and suddenly you're like, oh, it's over. You know, so I think for a lot of novice people, having more regular comps is a good thing, but the difference with a with a relatively new or novice lifter is, you know, we're not peaking for comps. I had one new guy who wanted to do his first comp after like 6 weeks of training at Burleigh, and I just said, like, we're not going to change your training at all. Like, we're just going to keep doing the sets of 5 and, you know, base level stuff you've been doing, and we'll just turn up and compete and have a good time and see where you're at, and then we just keep training. You know, it's much more about, you're just doing the comp for the experience of competing rather than for hitting big PBs and, you know, winning comps and stuff like that. So I think as long as you understand the difference between those things, you'll be okay. It's when people who I think are too new to competing get caught up in this idea, because they hear people like you and I say, oh, I do 2 or 3 comps a year. And so then suddenly they want to do this 6-month training cycle into a comp, and by month 4, because they weren't prepared for the work that was actually going to go into a process like that, by month 4 they're sick of it and they're burnt out, and they don't know how to get through those last couple of months. I think I've seen that a lot, and it's a trap that I think is easily avoided with the right approach to the process, not the outcome.
The other thing with that is, like, if they go for that longer approach and they're green to it all, by the time they get the comp, there's a higher risk of them messing up the comp.
Yes, because they put so much pressure on themselves. And
yeah, so they've spent 6 months and they're like, oh, I'm not any stronger, I've trained for 6 months. Doesn't mean you're not any stronger if you don't do well on comp day, if you don't know how to compete, right? Yeah,
exactly. And that's the thing. I think more than anything, it's the nerves factor. So many people really struggle with the nerves, and especially if you're not an experienced competitive athlete. You know, like I still get nervous before all my comps. I've been doing it for, you know, nearly 10 years at this point. But even then, like, I'm an experienced competitor. I've played sport my entire life. So I think I know how my body responds to, how my body and my brain, I guess, respond to the pressure of competition. And so you learn to use that. And we've talked about this before, but that idea that you can learn to use and harness the nerves on a day, not, you know, negate them completely. Because that's when you get the most out of your performance, when you can balance the nerves with, you know, psychological arousal and skill and all of those things. And then that all culminates to a big performance on the platform. But if the overriding emotion for the day is anxiety, then, and you know, that, like you said, gets worse if you spend 6 months building that anxiety up rather than just jump in and do it. I always say to people for their first comp, like, this is when the next one is, just do that one. And in some cases, it's like, this is in 2 weeks, you should just do it and get it over and done with. Yeah. And then you can build on the skill from there. And it works in most cases, if the person is willing and able to put their ego aside in a way that allows them to do a comp and not care about the numbers.
Yeah,
which is easier said than done.
One thing you touched on in your spiel was this idea of, like, training through a comp. You didn't use those exact words, but you were like, you know, you might just, you're not going to peak for it, you're just going to train and do the comp in the middle. And one thing you talked about, and well, we were off air as well, was this idea of soft peak. And I think those terms are kind of interchangeable. And that's a really important concept to understand as well. So when I was talking before about having 3 comps and one doesn't really matter, one's just there, that's exactly what I'm getting at, right? Yeah. It's just like you're doing your regular training, your whatever you want to call it, off-season training, hypertrophy training, whatever percentages you're working in, but that's going to fall between 70 and 90%. You're doing that regular training, and then you'll do a comp in the middle of that, and it's not like you go in completely unprepared. You'll be doing, well, what I tend to do for my lifters, if they're doing that sort of arrangement, is like, they'll have their regular training block, and then if the competition, say, towards the end of that block, in the maybe 1 or 2 weeks beforehand, just to get a bit more of the skill of, like, the comp environment, the comp arrangement, they'll do a couple of singles at 90%, 95%, something like that, just so they can walk into the comp and I'm just watching John.
It's still good. Do you see how smooth that was?
Take off a burly jumper to reveal a burly shirt. I love doing that. Like exactly the same logo on my hoodie that's on my shirt.
Branding, man. That's how it works.
That's right. Get it out there. But yeah, this idea of training through a comp is really important, because the other thing I find is that people who come to me and they've been in a training life where they are peaking way too frequently, is that they do this training, they don't peak for the comp, and they often do a lot better than they were when they were frequently peaking. It's just
how much of that do you think is physical, and how much of it do you think is psychological?
I think a lot of it's physical. I think a lot of it's coming into it a bit more well rested, as in they're not fatigued and they've got a bit more skill from just practicing lifting and getting better at lifting, because the psychological aspect often works against them in terms of they expect, or they've got this picture in their head of what they should be doing leading into a comp, and they've put expectations on the fact that, well, I haven't been doing singles for 4 weeks, so I'm going to be way weaker.
Yeah.
I don't know. What's your opinion?
I think it certainly varies case to case, because you're right. There are some that, bless you.
I went to turn the microphone off, but I didn't make it in time.
Yeah, I've narrowed down where the mute button is in Audacity, so I can click it, but I still haven't quite got that timing right. So yeah, I think it really depends on the lifter. I think there are some who peak too frequently, and the psychological stress of peaking is what gets them, and so they come into a comp and they're undercooked because for the last 4 weeks all they've been doing is stressing about the competition itself. Yeah. So those people often, in my experience, will benefit from just like a way less deliberate, and maybe deliberate's the wrong word, but an approach that stresses more just training than it does peaking. Like, even if we just don't call it peaking, like we throw a few singles in here and there, but it's not, I don't tell them it's a peaking cycle. Sometimes that's enough for those people to just take some of the pressure off. I think those people also benefit from a discussion around competition priorities. You know, like, is this competition a priority for you, or is this a building block for the next competition? So being able to understand the purpose of the meet is probably the best way to put it. You know, I'm sure Dylan understands that Pro Raw is just a stepping stone for big dogs this year, and like, while he'll still be excited and lifting something huge, it's just a building block. Like, it's not the end point, so to speak. So I think if you can, for those people that struggle with the psychological stress and building their own little, you know, pressure cooker of emotion, I think those people benefit from a softer approach to it sometimes. I think the physical standpoint's an interesting one. And again, I think from my experience, depends on the person. Some people really struggle with the jump to singles. Like, if they're not used to lifting singles and they don't have the requisite skill set that goes with high quality, high percentage singles, then they'll struggle with a lack of peaking, I think. But it really depends on how poorly they've done with their peaking process in the past. You know, there are some people who their idea of peaking is circa max box squats with 17 bands, and, you know, all they do is beat the shit out of themselves, or like they deload by doing 3 sets of 8 on everything. And, you know, I think those people benefit often from just a well-designed, well put together, thought through peaking process.
365 strong, bro.
There's no weight classes in the jungle, which is a good thing, because we're all in a gym. It's not the fucking jungle. I mean, there's some spiders in my gym, but it's not a jungle.
I saw Callum Von Moger training at a jungle gym where all the weights were like rocks and tree trunks.
Yeah, nice. Have you seen there's a video that floats around Facebook of this dude building his own weights set in the forest somewhere, and he makes all these bars out of bamboo and then molds plates out of mud and then fires them in a like DIY kiln and gets these cool, like, you know, and like he goes through the process of like weighing them out on a balance so that they're even, and yeah, it's really impressive. I'll find it and send it to you. That's legit training in the jungle. Like, he built his own equipment to train in the jungle. It was pretty cool. But not particularly relevant to powerlifting in general. So what is, from a coaching perspective, what is a post, or what's the difference in a postseason, post-competition phase for someone like Dylan who's going back into another comp in, October's when Big Dogs is, versus someone who, say, is going to a much closer comp like Nationals in June, versus someone who's, not doing another comp till States next year? What would the difference in approach be from your point of view?
Yeah, so I mean, taking Dylan further as the case study, coming down off Pro Raw, it goes immediately. Yeah, there's a rest period, but then when we get back into training, it goes back into that more like non-specific stuff, avoiding some of the little things that have popped up at the end of this prep. So a lot of the times these bigger guys tend to get like this elbow pain, shoulder pain. In Dylan's case, he's been dealing with a lot of like adductor / groin pain. So reducing the intensity significantly, getting some work capacity and conditioning back, avoiding and ailing those little I guess pre-injuries.
Yeah.
And then working from there directly into like the actual work, and then building up linearly into another peak. Like, it's really quite simple when you break it down. I think people spend so much time deliberating and overcomplicating things. But for me and my lifters, I try to get them to spend the vast majority of their training time living in that land between sort of 70 and 85%.
Yep.
And I think 85% does err on the side of like 85 to 90 eventually, but it's modulated based on the strength that they've built, so their relative max increases over that time. So what is 85% now, what becomes 90% is eventually 85%, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
Yeah, so the difference then with someone that would be peaking earlier, like June, if they're coming down off a competition at the end of March, they've got April, May, and then going into a competition in June, is that they don't have a lot of time to do any work. So it's about speaking with the lifter and analysing their expectations, aiming to correct on anything that may have gone wrong on the last peak or at the last comp, and just realising that you're probably not going to get a hell of a lot stronger, but we can work on correcting anything that may have gone wrong in that last prep. If the prep went perfectly, it's like we're going to try and cram in as much work as we can do safely in the time between that comp and the next comp, and then peak hard into the comp and hopefully put a little bit more on the total.
Yeah, and I think that's, like you said, it always seems so simple when you put it out like that, and yet it seems to be a thing that so many people get wrong or do poorly. Maybe not getting wrong's the wrong way to look at it, but are doing it in a way that's just not as effective. I know that's one of the biggest mistakes I made in my more serious powerlifting career was not properly managing time in between competitions. I was a little too guilty of being like, oh, well, I've done one comp, I've got another one in 14 weeks, I'm going to take a week to just do nothing and then just get strong again. And I think if I could go back and change that, that'd be great. And I'd probably put a better total on the platform, but I also learnt a lot in that time, so I think it's one of those things that I don't think you know what it feels like to crush yourself repeatedly for a series of comps and then get to the end of it and go, oh, that was not worth it, until you've done it. You and I can sit here and preach to people about properly managing stuff, but sometimes you finish a comp and you get really excited about the prospect of doing the next comp, or the one I always did was like, fuck, I didn't perform how I wanted to at that competition. When's the next opportunity I can work towards to redeem myself for that shitty performance? And inevitably that second comp is worse because you don't give yourself the time to rebuild things and remove the issues that you're having with those niggling injuries that pop up and all of those sort of things that a well-managed yearly plan will help you do well for a long period of time. And I think longevity is the key when we have this discussion. Is if you want to be really strong, you should do this for a long time. The best lifters are the best lifters because they've been doing it forever. And Ed Cohn, who word on the street is might be on the podcast soon. Whoa, that's exciting. Spoiler alert. And yeah, he was the best in the world because he was the best for 20 years. You know, like we did the maths last time he was in Canberra. It was like something like 20 kilos a year on his total for 20 years. And the consistency in strength, growth, and results, and all those sort of things that comes from just decades of work managed well is the important thing. I think it's really easy to just work hard, but understanding how you manage the training process across a year is really important. And like you said earlier, it's something that powerlifters are probably doing better now, but I think because powerlifting wasn't a real sport 10 years ago, it was just something a bunch of meatheads did in garages, that longer term concept of like sports planning and the training year and, you know, multi-year training plans were just something that wasn't spoken about as much. You know, in weightlifting, it's been quads forever because it's a 4-year sport. So everything revolves around the Olympic cycle, which means, you know, I know all the weightlifters I follow, or the good weightlifters I follow, just now like ramping all their training up. It's now they're at the business end of their training quad. You know, they're talking about a 4-year plan to get them to the Olympics. And I think if you're a powerlifter who can have, like maybe you don't need a 4-year plan, but having a couple of years to be like, okay, well, here's where I want to be at nationals this year, and here's where I want to be the year after that. I think that goes somewhat to helping you plan this in a way that makes it manageable over the long term. When all you do is look at the next 12-week cycle, you're very quickly going to burn yourself out.
I think the hard thing as well, the
hard thing is having a camera that records for longer than 25 minutes.
It hadn't cut out just yet, but it was about to cut out. I think not the hard thing, the good thing is how much attention has been given now to our little world of strength sports, and especially powerlifting, from the scientific community. When you've got the superstars like Greg Knuckles, like Mike Israetel, like Juggernaut putting out this kind of content where it's giving us a more scientific approach, because we come from the dark ages of powerlifting, where powerlifting had pretty much died. This rise of like the multiply zombies had occurred, and that's where we were getting our information from. Back. Take it. Yeah, like before then it was kind of bro science, and then it was those guys, which was like ultra bro science for a sport that's essentially completely different to raw powerlifting. Ultra bro science
with like just a sprinkling of random Russian sports science. That like a drastically over extrapolated points about minute training pieces that have then been applied in a way that doesn't make any logical sense.
Exactly. And those kind of notions stuck around for so long, and it's only just
they're still around. That's the thing that amazes me sometimes, is that people are still like, oh, this is definitely the best way to do it. Man, if it was the best way to do it, there'd be a lot more people at the top who were doing that.
That's right. In the last 3 to 4 years, there's been this emergence, though, of like a stronger scientific approach. And like we say, it's funny because it's so easy to get right. It's so simple, but it's only become simple because of that kind of stuff. And it's simple for us, I guess, because we have the biased opinion or the biased viewpoint of the fact that we've done it for hundreds and hundreds of people. Yes. Rather than just playing around with it with ourselves, because when we were playing around with it I just got caught up with about to say playing with ourselves. When we were playing with ourselves, there wasn't, the relative. We get one lifter to play with for 12 weeks, and then another 12 weeks, and then another 12 weeks.
Monogamy is the worst.
Yes. So
it just means the experiments take longer, right? Like that's the thing is, when you're writing these training plans and you're planning out a year, you only get one person to experiment on if you're an individual, and not having the access to the information. Because not only I agree with you. I think the scientific approach, or the science, has come back into the sport. But I think that potentially some of that science has always been there. We just haven't had the access to it. But now with the freedom of information that comes from podcasts and social media platforms, it allows you access to all of these people who previously were essentially constrained to publish scientific papers and things that are really hard to digest for someone who's just an everyday, weekend lifter. That's where I think things like Greg Knuckles and I think it's Eric Helms do MASS, the monthly applied strength science or something like that.
The reviews, they're fucking fantastic.
Yeah, I've got a fucking whole ton of them that I haven't gone back through yet, but I get the email every month that says I paid for it, and I'm like, damn, I should read those. Just have a stack of them sitting there waiting to be read.
It's so funny. I remember the first program that I ever wrote for myself that I ever actually put on paper. And it was a bastardized version of 531, and I called it 321. And it was essentially because I didn't want to do sets of 5. And I thought deloading was stupid. So essentially what I would do would be 3 sets of 3. And on the last set was an AMRAP. And then the next week was 3 sets of 2, last set AMRAP, and then the same thing on the singles week. And then I'd take the weight from the singles and turn that into the weight for the threes in the next block. And as you can imagine, I would get through 3 blocks because I started way too high because I'd set the 1 at my current max. I'd get through 2 blocks and then burn out and then be like, okay, I need to start again, and start at the same point. And I did that for fucking ages. So I had a squat max of 220 for a year because that's what I thought training was. And then one of my friends who had done reading on training was like, man, you're always peaking. You're constantly peaking. And I was like, I got so offended. I'm like, you're offending my me to my inner core.
Delicate sensibilities.
My inner core, which I don't train because I was too fatigued from doing max effort all the time.
And because you don't need to train it, because you just squats and deadlifts are enough to get your core work in. You don't need anything else. You'll be fine.
That's right, but that was my understanding of programming in 2010 because there wasn't any real reliable information out there, or when you would go fishing for it, you'd either get Westside with some sort of conjugate system, 531, a Mad Cow's 5x5, a Shaco arrangement, or smaller. Those were your options. And of course, I ran through all of those. I was like, okay,
as you do.
I'm going to bastardize the best system ever and get me strong as fuck. And here I am now, 3 hip surgeries later. So,
yeah. If only you could go back and unlearn those lessons. Yeah, but I think that's the thing that maybe it's... And saying it's a negative is a bad thing, I think. But I think there's something to be said for the pendulum swinging too far back in the other direction towards science. I think there's a group of people in the fitness industry who call themselves evidence-based, and their evidence is they only work on things that are published in scientific papers. And while that is in fact evidence, and in most cases very valid evidence, so is anecdotal evidence, like the evidence that you and I get through writing programs and testing them with people and getting results. And so I think potentially the rise of science and the accessibility of scientific literature and stuff like that might have some detriment to people who never develop their own training philosophy. They always rely on information given to them by other people. Because I think ultimately the training process is an experiment, right? We're all in this to try and get stronger over a period of time and find out what works for us. Because while we're not all beautifully unique snowflakes and we all need our perfectly personalized training program that's based on our HRV score for the last week and our mood, I think there's something to be said for trying things and trying new approaches, just if only to learn what not to do. I think there's some validity in that. Having a coach definitely helps you avoid the mistakes that we made. But that's not to say that there isn't value in making some of those mistakes.
You know, I really don't believe that the term evidence-based belongs in a coach's vocabulary at all. And I'll tell you why. Like, I come from my degree was a health science degree. We spent 18 months at least where half of our subjects were based around reading and understanding the research specific to our area, not all research, right? Because research applied to one area doesn't mean you can read research articles in a completely different field. You might understand some of the concepts, but actually, dissecting them and being able to critically analyze them is a skill specific to
and being able
each
to
individual.
apply them as well. Like, take the scientific conclusion or endpoint and extrapolate that into real world application. That's a skill
right.
set
So,
unto itself.
which is why stuff like maths is such a golden ticket, because these people understand how to read those. You see people all the time, I'll read this article or I read this research paper. I'm like, you didn't read it. You looked at words on paper. You understand the words. You don't understand what you're reading though, because you have to do so much groundwork, so much base understanding, prerequisite knowledge to even understand what you're looking at and to be able to critically analyze that. There is so much that goes into analyzing research articles to be able to call yourself evidence-based when you're in an actual practice like some sort of scientific endeavor. If you're fucking training people at a gym, your practice is not evidence-based.
So I disagree, because I think it depends on your definition of evidence. I would say you have evidence that you can get results for people in powerlifting because you've got a lot of people that you've gotten results. That's evidence. It might not be placebo-controlled, double-blind study, scientific level of, like, I think there's a hierarchy of evidence.
Oh, yeah. I get what you're saying, but that term evidence-based is specifically referring to that kind of level of evidence, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's a misuse of the term. It's a bastardization of the term, which is really annoying.
Yeah, I think we both agree on that. And
Because
there's a
I
whole series of people that like to claim that. It's like, man, just because you read a bunch of abstracts and then you try and apply that to training doesn't make you evidence-based.
Well, it's the endeavor of trying to make yourself sound smarter, right?
Yes.
If you say I'm evidence-based, when someone says that they are evidence-based, it's like, fuck. What's your evidence? Oh, you went to Macca's and you liked it, therefore your evidence is that you like Macca's, therefore you're evidence-based. Like, what? Come on. Don't call yourself evidence-based. It's like, I'm an evidence-based coach. No, your coaching may be evidence-based. Like, the fact that you're even calling yourself evidence-based pisses me off.
Salty Thomas. It only took us 38 minutes, but we got there.
I had my affogato. I'm showing the camera. I'll show you too. It's all gone.
Delicious.
It's only just starting to kick in. I've been mixing a little bit of chocolate powder into it as well, which makes it a little bit more spicy.
Because your palate's not quite refined enough to cope with actual coffee.
Correct, yes.
So you mix it with ice cream and chocolate powder, you fucking child.
Right. I basically want coffee-flavoured sugar to call myself an adult.
No, what you want is sugar-flavoured coffee. There's a difference.
All right. Do we have anything to add to the year training plan? Because I think that's succinct enough.
Yeah, I think
without going into the nitty-gritty of exactly what percentages to be doing at what time, but I think that's up to you to research and read and understand.
Yeah, well, I think that's somewhat beyond the scope of what we talk about. We tend to focus instead on principles, right? And these discussions that look at why you're doing things and understanding the ideas behind that. And if you take your powerlifting relatively seriously, you should be training in a way that is conducive to improvements in performance over years and decades, not months and weeks. And how you do your training based around that should look a little bit different to just competing every 12 weeks.
Exactly. Excellent.
Let's leave things there.
I will see you next week for an in-person podcast.
Oh, shit. I'm excited. Are you not going to be wearing pants for that too? That would be my preference, just quietly.
Yeah, well, yes, that can be arranged. No issue whatsoever.
Excellent.
For now, give us a 5-star review. Tag us in Instagram. I am at Tombro7.
I'm at JustShero. and tell your mum about our sweet powerlifting podcast. If she's anything like my mum, she probably won't care.
You know what? Sorry, just before we end, I did a poll on Instagram the other day, and I'd put yes, no too close to the edge of the screen, and I knew there were a bunch of false readings because my mum had voted on them. And I was like, my mum doesn't know any of this stuff, and if she did, she wouldn't vote on it anyway. But that's the end of the podcast. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you next time.